Hi, Connection Christian. I'm going to be going over Exodus 12, verses 33 to chapter 13, verse 16. The main theme that we see through these verses hits on the Passover, but it also gives us some instructions from God about obedience and faithfulness for generations to come. So in the first couple verses of Exodus 12, 33 through 42, we see the Pharaoh of Egypt tell Moses and Aaron, which they were both brothers, to take their people and leave Egypt. It kind of gotten to a point where they were just like, everybody's sinning, you guys just need to leave. So the Egyptians tried to rush Moses and their people out and said, if you don't hurry and leave, you'll die. So Moses gathers his people. They're in such a haste to leave that they couldn't properly finish making their bread. So they had bread without yeast that had risen. But basically Moses gathers his people. He gets some belongings from the Egyptians, like clothes and metals and gold. And then it says there's about like 6,000 men and women and children, and then they take their flocks and their herds and they just travel where the Lord leads them to. And a little backstory in those last couple verses of that section, it says the people had been in Israel for 430 years, and that's exactly when the Lord kept his promise and delivered them out. So what we learn here is that God's faithful. He keeps his promises to us, and that we just need to remember that he's a covenant-keeping God, that he's going to keep his promises, and as long as we're obedient, he's going to deliver us from certain situations. We also learned that it's always been God's plan. God always has a plan for us. He takes that plan, he puts it in action, and when he does put it in action, we see his power throughout, and all we have to do is just obey. We just have to be faithful and obey, and he'll deliver us. In verses 43 through 50, we start to get into some of the Passover restrictions and instructions. So there's 3 things that we learn about the Passover. One, that it's costly. It obviously took a lot of effort for the Israelites to take the time to sacrifice these lambs. It also took a lot of waiting and time there, just because they had to wait for God's deliverance. And then obviously it took a lot of resources. If you're taking a lamb for every household, you're sacrificing a lot of lambs. And then we also learned that God expected the best. So he didn't want the leftovers brought to him. He wanted the best lamb, one that was as close to perfect as the Israelites could bring to him. We also learned that the Passover is communal. So the lamb that was sacrificed didn't cover just one individual, it covered an entire household. And so we learned that God didn't he came to save the masses and individuals, but by participating in Passover, it allowed us to see him take us as a group. And then we also learned that the Passover was conciliatory. So the Passover basically revealed Israel's biggest issue, and that's that not that we were, as people, slaves to Egypt, but that we were sinful in nature, and that we weren't right standing before God, and we needed to get right with him. So the major theme with the Passover is that the Passover was initiated by God for his people. And he put some rules and restrictions kind of with Passover in this scripture. He says, no foreigners. So this goes to show us that only Israelites were held and allowed to participate, which just basically goes to the purity of the Passover. It also shows that the Israelites were chosen specifically. They were saved for a specific purpose, and that was to worship God. He wanted us to worship him, come to communion with him, and in order to do so, we had to reconcile. And God used the Passover to remind his people that at one point he'd provided a way out, and we just needed to be in communion with him, and he would continue to provide those answers for us. Later in the scripture, he puts some other statutes to the Passover. It was to be eaten in one house. Then no flesh shall be taken outside of the home. You shall not break any of its bones, and it should be observed by all of Israel. In verses 48 through 49, though, it does say that if, somebody that was not an Israelite wanted to participate, they could. They just had to kind of show dedication to the Lord, show obedience, and that they were faithful to him. So in order to do that and participate in Passover, they had to be circumcised. And I did a little research, but basically it sounds like the act of circumcision was initiated to set Israelites apart so that you could see, like, oh, this is a non-Israelite, this is an Israelite. But it also reminded them their need for purity. So it was kind of like an inward reminder as well as an outward difference in appearance. So the Passover reveals to us that we needed a sacrifice that had to be perfect, unblemished, and unbroken, and to be freed from sin. And we see that in Jesus later on. And the circumcision demanded people to look inward and try to study their soul and where they sat purity-wise. It also required perfect obedience because Jesus set out these specific instructions and he wanted them to be followed from generation to generation to generation. And then we get to the passages in Exodus 13, verses 1 through 16. God has talked about the Passover, and he is about to give his last commandments before he allows the Israelites to go into the promised land. So consecration of the firstborn and eating of unleavened bread. So the importance of the firstborn is that we may give God the first things in our life, that we give him the best, that we're willing to sacrifice, our children to be obedient to him. The bread was a reminder of all he has done and will do for us. We also learn about community, faith. Faith revolves around community. When we aren't surrounded by individuals that are seeking the same purpose to be faithful and obedient to God, we can kind of be led astray and wander. So God created community within the church and within the Israelites so that we would have others to share our faith with. And then we learn a couple things about how faith matures through our life. So we watch as this child's born, and they find a community. They're raised in the church. They might find a mentor, and the majority of us find that mentor probably in our parents because they were the first ones to expose us to the word, take us to church, etc. Then we see the child mature and start to ask questions about how faith pertains to them personally and how certain things affect them in their own life. And that's just another step in our faith maturity. And then once they kind of figure out, what it means to them personally, we start to see them live out their testimony, like how he lives in us, how he has taken care of us, how he's healed us. They start to learn that and they share that. And that's truly when our souls as believers are transformed, but then we also are given the power to transform the souls of other people that are believers. So there's a lot of information that's kind of packed into the Passover scripture and passages. I had to go through it really quick, but I've had to read it a couple times just to kind of grasp everything that the Lord's trying to show me and teach me. So I would just encourage all of you to continue to read through it. Maybe do some studies on the side and do a little research of your own, because there is a ton of information about how God wanted our obedience to look like, how he wanted our faith to mature, and just some history that I think is really important to our journey as Christians. So I hope you guys have a great weekend.